The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello and welcome to this IPQ Hub webinar on presentation and reflection skills. Thank you for joining me today. My name is Robin Drummond. I'm the assessment designer for the IPQ, and I'm very pleased to have you here today to talk about a few specific parts of the IPQ process, and that's the presentation and the summary and reflection. Now, before we begin, I just want to check that everybody can hear me. So on the right-hand side, you should be able to see a control panel, and there's an option to ask questions. Can I ask that you just very quickly just write a quick hello or your name or whatever you like in the question box, just so I can see that there are people out there and that they can hear me okay. Brilliant. So I've got a few already. Thank you very much, Anja. That's excellent. Just seeing if there's any more people. I can see there's quite a few. I've only had one so far. So it's just on the right hand side. This will be useful a bit later on. Oh, brilliant. Here we go. Lulu, a few more. Brilliant. Thank you very much. That's good to see. So I can see that people can hear me. Excellent. And hopefully you can also see the presentation screen, which is IPQ Hub session number 3. So if there's any problems with that, let me know on the question panel as we go. So brilliant. So we've got about an hour today, and like I said, we're looking at a particular aspect or two aspects of the independent project qualification process. And this won't apply to everybody, but hopefully for at least some of you, this will coincide roughly with the time in the school year that you'll be looking at things like presentations and the summary and reflection page in the production log. If that doesn't apply to you, it obviously doesn't matter, because you can organise the IPQ through your school calendar however you like. But we've obviously tried to estimate roughly the time at which we think most people will be doing these parts of the project. So just to quickly recap what the IPQ is. The IPQ involves students doing the following: choosing an area of personal interest. That's a key part of the IPQ. Students, it's up to them what they do and how they do it. Students draft a title and aims for the project. They plan, research and carry out the project, completing a 5,000 word report, and they deliver a presentation on the process and findings. That's obviously one of the things we'll look at today. And obviously it's available for teaching now, being first assessed this year. So the first awards will go out this summer. Just to say as well, if there's anybody out there who isn't delivering the IPQ at the moment, then obviously you're very welcome on this webinar equally. We're aware that there are schools out there looking at the IPQ and interested in it. So this applies to you as much as anyone, but just be aware that we're only looking at a particular aspect of the process. I imagine for most of you, you're currently delivering the IPQ and looking for some further guidance and support on these particular areas. Just a reminder as well that so far this is the third of these webinars, and we're doing 4. So the first one was on planning and researching and getting a project and IPQ up and running. The second one was on report writing, and this one's obviously on presentation and reflection. And the last one will be on assessing the IPQ. So again, hopefully you can see we've tried to organise them in the process in which they would naturally follow as schools go through the delivery of the IPQ. So the agenda today is quite simple. There'll be an introduction where we look at the 2 areas roughly and briefly. I'll look at the presentation in more detail. I'll look at the reflection in more detail, and there'll be a chance at the end for questions. So with questions, please feel free to ask any as we go along. But what I'll do is at the end of the webinar, or the end of my presentation, I'll then look at all the questions at the same time, rather than trying to answer them as we go along. I think that works a bit better. So like I said, feel free to ask any, but I will look at them all together at the end. Okay, so let's begin. So an introduction to both of these areas. bear with me a second. I'm just going to close my control panel so I can see the slides as well. Brilliant. So the presentation and the reflection. And by the way, when I say reflection, what we mean today is the summary and reflection page in the production log, which is the last page of the production log, and it's one that the students complete on their own. So that's what I mean by reflection. So the presentation and the reflection are key aspects of the IPQ, and they're compulsory. So students must complete them in order to submit a project. They give the students the opportunity to demonstrate key project management skills, including communication and evaluation. Please remember that the IPQ is a project qualification. It's not just a long essay or report. It's essentially a project, and that's exactly how it's assessed. It's assessed as a project, and obviously, you know, you'll be familiar with the assessment objectives. But a very quick look at them, and we'll look at some of them in a minute, and we'll show you that it's assessed very much in this way. It's not just an essay. Sometimes there can be a slight tendency to put less emphasis on the presentation and the reflection and so on, because you know they're not core parts of the actual 5,000 word report. But I want to make it clear that's a mistake. They're as important to the project as the report and the production log, other parts of the production log. And the presentation and the review are not add-ons. I mean, this is what I've been saying to the report and the log. They're integral aspects of the process. And obviously the taught skills program should reflect this. So a few places where we can see the importance of the presentation and the reflection. In the actual grading process, and like I said, the next hub session, the fourth one, we'll look at this in more detail, but you can see that actually two of the things which are necessary for students to do in order for a supervisor to grade their work is that there needs to be a presentation, and the student needs to show evidence of evaluating the strengths and weaknesses of the project, i.e. a reflection. So they're necessary parts. Equally, in the specification, there's a brilliant list of taught skills that centres should deliver, and just a reminder that there's lots of resources on the Oxford AQA website to help you with that, as well as a textbook that's available. But there are two overall areas specifically focused on presentation and reflecting. So it really is a core part of what's happening. And again, with the assessment objectives, so these are all 5 assessment objectives. You can see primarily we're looking at AO5 when it comes to the reflection, and also AO4, which mentions the presentation. So it's very much grounded in what the IPQ is and how it's assessed. So let's look at the presentation in more detail. And some of what I'm about to say is information I've taken directly from 2 documents. One is the IPQ specification, and the other is the IPQ teacher guidance document. And both of these documents are on the Oxford AQA website, and I would really encourage you to, particularly if you're a coordinator, to make sure you know those documents back to front. Particularly the teacher guidance document, which in some sense is a summary of the specification. They're really good documents to help you understand the overall process involved with the IPQ. So presentation, what are the basics? So as I said before, along with the production log and the report, all IPQs must include evidence of a presentation. So I've always thought of an IPQ as made of 3 things. One is the production log, one is the report, and one is the presentation. And they're all equally necessary for a student to complete and submit, and for supervisors to assess an IPQ. The presentation provides students with an opportunity to tell the story of their project journey, right from the beginning, from deciding what they want to do to the final reflections. Now, there's lots to the presentation, which I'm going to go through, but that is my overall best way to describe what the presentation does. It tells the story of their journey, of their project journey, from beginning to end. It's not just about reporting on what they found out in terms of conclusions in the report. It's not just about talking about the sources or their planning and so on. It's about the entire journey from beginning to end, telling the story of the project. It's also a chance for students to gain credit, not access in other parts of the project. So if the production log is a bit brief in places and the student hasn't really got into much detail, It can be a way for students to gain credit for those areas where maybe planning, for example, where they didn't give as much detail as they could have earlier on in the production log. I'll talk a bit more about that later on to show you what I mean in particular. Presentation should do the following. It should take the form of a verbal presentation with or without the use of presentation software. So in my experience of the EPQ in the UK, which is the UK version of the IPQ, from which the IPQ is based, most students tend to use some kind of presentation software, for example, PowerPoint, as I'm doing today, but it's not necessary. They don't have to. They could do it purely verbally, just talking to a group. The presentation must cover the project, product, and whole process. So that's what I mean about telling the story. It has to talk about the product, which is the report, and the findings of the report. So, the answer to the question that the students set themselves. But it also must cover the whole process from beginning to end. Initial ideas, planning, research, making decisions, and so on. It must be delivered to a non-specialist audience. It must be approximately 10 minutes long and live, and it must be followed by approximately 10 minutes of Q&A, and that must be live Q&A straight after the presentation. So it has to be a 20-minute session, and it must be delivered to a minimum of 2 people, one of whom must be the supervisor. Now, the supervisor, this is from the specification, the supervisor is required to attend the presentation, we just saw that, keep a comprehensive log of the nature of the audience, the nature of the presentation, and the delivery of the presentation, and of Q&A. So all of those things are done by the supervisor in the production log, and I will show you in a bit exactly where the supervisor does that, and a couple of examples of how to do it well. And this will form the basis of the assessment evidence relating to this aspect of the qualification. So this is an example, and there's a few places in the production log where this happens, but not many, where actually the student can gain credit, assessment credit, for what the supervisor writes. So if the supervisor doesn't do this fully, properly, in enough detail, if the supervisor doesn't reflect accurately and fully what the student does, then the supervisor will not be enabling the student to get the mark, to get the grade that they, the assessment that they need, they deserve. So presentation, the format, presentation may involve the use of flip charts, posters, Prezi, PowerPoint, or short excerpts of video material. So just like the project, the IPQ can be on anything the student likes. How the student delivers the presentation as well is largely up to them. It's very open on how they do it. There are many ways that a presentation might be conducted. For example, as a sort of traditional university-style viva, witnessed by at least one person in addition to the supervisor. It could be in the form of a lecture. It could be in the form of a seminar. It could be in the form of a sort of marketplace situation. This would be particularly good for large cohorts where you've got lots of presentations, where the coordinator's got lots of presentations to organize. Each student could have a stand, for example, to conduct their presentation several times to a number of small groups. Now, in my experience, with the EPQ, which is almost identical to the IPQ in the UK, I've had as a coordinator, I had from 5 students one year to nearly 100 students another year. And how you organize the presentations is key, and it is a direct result of how many students you have. If you've got a very small number of students, then it's very easy to simply book a room or have a classroom, have a screen up. Students can present from a PowerPoint or however they like, and maybe the audience is just the other IPQ students and the supervisor. That's perfectly fine, and that's very similar to what I used to do with small numbers. When you've got larger numbers and the coordinator, the IPQ coordinator, will need to make sure everything is organized, it can be trickier. You can just do what I just described on a supervisor scale. So each supervisor is responsible for organizing their presentations. That's fine. Or you can try and do something bigger, and there's no reason why you can't invite parents or people from outside to come and watch and so on. It's really up to you how you organize them, but it is worth thinking, what's going to suit your students, what's going to suit your cohort, how many students you have, and your particular school calendar environment and so on. What I did in the last school I taught at was we had a big library which had lots of separate rooms, and I used to hire the whole library out for a whole evening, so 2 or 3 hours, and the students would come in and each student would be assigned a particular room in the library. It was set up to deliver presentations, and maybe there were sort of 2 or 3, 4 different presentations in each room, one after the other, and it was a whole presentation evening, and other students could come and watch, other teachers could come and watch, and it's an amazing opportunity for IPQ students to showcase what they've done. In my experience, the bigger you make the event, the more special it becomes. But as I said, there's no that's not compulsory in any way. So most, if not all, presentations will benefit from visual aids. The type of visual aids you'll use will depend on the type of project you have. So if you're doing a sort of scientific type IPQ with lots of numerical data, you might want to be thinking about, students might want to be thinking about using graphs, tables, having visuals to represent information in a very clear and concise way. Remember, there's only 10 minutes for the presentation. If you have more of a kind of essay-based IPQ, images are a really good way to get the audience interested in what you're talking about, and so on. So the presentation should not only focus on the project product, but should ideally also cover the following. And again, I'm repeating myself here, but I want to make it very clear what the project is about, the reasoning that underpins the project, the aims and objectives of the project, what research has been undertaken, a review of performance and achievements, lessons learned whilst undertaking the project, and how the project might affect the student's future career education. Now, there's no I think this might be in the teacher guidance document. There's no reason why this can't be used as a rough structure to give to students or to encourage them to organise their presentations. But also, please make sure that you're not too prescriptive in what you say to students. Make it very clear that students must cover the story of their project, what they've done, how they've done it, their conclusions. Sometimes it can be tempting to try and control the presentations too much to make sure they do everything they should do. So there's a balance there to get between, as I've said before in previous webinars, between guiding the students appropriately and directing them, i.e. basically telling them what to do and taking away some of their autonomy, which is obviously what the IPQ is all about. Presentation may be given in English or the student's first language. So this is the one part of the IPQ process that can be completed in the first language if it's not English. Should this happen, then an authenticated translation to English should be provided along with the record of the presentation. So, and all written evidence should be in English. So the production log should be completed fully in English. But the presentation itself can be given in a first language, a native language, if that isn't English. All assessment evidence needs to be in English as well, so bear that in mind. So the Q&A session, now the use of so this is led primarily by the supervisor, but it doesn't have to only be questions from the supervisor. Anybody can ask questions. It can be other IPQ students, other teachers, and so on. But the supervisor should be guiding that session, and they should be conscious that the right kind of questions are asked and responded to, and I'll explain what I mean by that in a minute. The use of an identical list of questions for all students is not advisable. Questions should be specific to the student and spontaneous. So as I said before, with the structure, supervisors, please don't go into the presentation saying, right, I'm going to ask every student the same 5 questions. Your questions must respond to the specific presentation you've seen. Individual targeted questioning enables students' knowledge and understanding of issues to arise from their project to be measured. Supervisors may hear valid evidence and answers to questions that do not appear elsewhere in the student's final package of evidence. So this is what I mentioned at the beginning. It's very important that the supervisors in the presentation need to be quite sort of savvy and astute and aware of what's happening. And if they know that a student that they've been supervising hasn't really shown a huge amount of evidence in terms of assessing their resources, or the planning was a bit poor, or the aims and objectives weren't really fully documented or clarified, this Q&A session is an excellent opportunity for the supervisor to ask questions specifically about those aspects of the project. The student will respond, and the supervisor will record their responses, and that will become assessment evidence. So it's a bit like a last chance for students to be able to provide evidence for the process that they've gone through. Now, again, supervisors shouldn't feel that to be a burden. And personally, what I've always done is just based it on the presentation. So I would be sitting there watching a student's presentation, one of my students. I obviously know what their project is on, but I haven't looked through their production log already. I haven't read the report, you know, or commented on drafts or anything like that. I'm watching the presentation, and if I feel from the presentation that there wasn't really enough on planning, I may ask a question about planning. Or if I don't really think they fully covered what their final conclusion was in their report, I'll ask a specific question about that. And that way it just makes sure that it's very clear exactly what the student did. But remember, there's only 10 minutes for the Q&A, so and you might want to allow other people to ask questions, but at least one or two of the questions should certainly be coming from the supervisor. Supervisors should use a question and answer session to put such evidence in the public domain. This is what I just said, by writing down student answers. Another tip from my own experience is, as a supervisor watching a presentation, and you'll probably watch more than one because it's likely that you'll have more than one IPQ student, it can be a lot to do to watch your presentation, to be running the event, to be writing down students' responses and so on. So as a supervisor, you don't have to do this, but you might consider recording the presentations. And I know some EPQ supervisors in the UK do this. You record the presentation and listen back to it, at least the Q&A section, so that you can then write down the student responses and so on there. Otherwise, you can end up trying to do too much stuff in the presentation, and it can be somewhat stressful for the supervisor. Presentation evidence. Physical evidence of the presentation is not compulsory, so students don't have to submit PowerPoint slides, for example, with their report and production log. The relevant pages in the production log is the evidence of the presentation, that it took place and what it involved, what it contained. However, in my experience, most students do and will include, for example, PowerPoint slides if they use the PowerPoint, and that's perfectly fine. There's no reason not to do that. Supervisors must complete presentation record part B of the production log fully and in detail to give moderators a complete overview of the student's performance. And all assessment is evidence-based. So if grades are awarded that credit the student's response to questioning, a record of the questions asked and answers must be given must be supplied, so this is visible for moderators. So so this bit is very much on the supervisor to complete the relevant paperwork. So let's look at the relevant part of the production log to get a clear idea of what we're talking about. So here you've got the presentation record part A. So this is towards the end of the production log. There's a part A and a part B to do the presentation. The part A is to be completed by the candidate, and the part B is to be completed by the supervisor. So this is what the student completes before the presentation. The first section, the student gives details of the structure and format of the presentation. The second section, the student has to describe the content of the presentation, and there's two parts, and again this is echoing what I said before. They need to say something about the project process, and they need to say something about the project findings and conclusions. It's important that presentation covers both of these, and that's clear right from the beginning. There's also a section for students to make changes to their presentation if they do a rehearsal or discuss it with a supervisor or somebody else. Now that's not necessary. Students don't have to do that, but again, in my experience, very generally the students who do particularly well are those who are particularly conscientious and are prepared and want to do a practice of their presentation in some form to someone to get feedback to then make some changes to it. And obviously I'd highly recommend that. And I mean, even, you know, we all know that going through something first of all really helps with the second time. Whereas if you're doing something for the first time, you can't always anticipate problems that might come up. So here's an example of a student presentation record part A. Now, there's various exemplars or examples that I'm going to show you today. I'm not going to read through them all because we don't have enough time. Obviously, this PowerPoint will be made available sometime after this webinar. So I've partly designed this presentation that you could then go and look at it again in a bit more detail and see exactly what I'm talking about. But I've annotated everything so that it should make sense to somebody looking at it, effectively reading it. But we'll have a sort of brief look just to make sense of it. So this is what the student completes. You can see there's lots of good detail there. The student's given a nice clear statement about the format of the presentation. I mean, you know, how much should students write in a production log is a bit like, you know, how long is a piece of string? Some students write very clearly and concisely and can say the same amount of, give the same information in half the space as another student. So generally, I wouldn't expect to see more than that amount of text in that section. But if students do, it's not a problem. But just be aware of them being clear about what they're doing. In this section here, students have given some clear detail on the process involved, but perhaps a bit more could be said on the planning itself. So again, you can have a look through there, but you know, I'm always keen to see the student talking about the planning in the presentation, because you know, an IPQ or any kind of project succeeds or fails on the basis of the planning. I mean, the planning is so key, what the student intends to do, how they intend to do it, when, and so on. That I want to see right from the beginning that the students including something about planning in there. So just, I mean, if it helps, my own experience, you know, right at this stage, I'll just be thinking, has the student made it clear what their main conclusions are, which is the next section, how they've answered their question, were their aims and objectives clear, is the planning documented and commented on, is the research discussed, as a student talked about challenges or difficulties they faced and so on. So it's good to have in mind. Again, they're clear and focused here in terms of the conclusions that they reach. They don't actually mention here what the conclusion is. That's not, you know, they might do, and I probably would myself if I was a student. This student doesn't, but they've said that they're going to talk about the conclusion. So at this point, you know, we'd accept that that was fine. This is the last section. So you can see here that this is a student who did do a practice of the presentation, and it was very beneficial for this student. So there's excellent development, there's clear detail, they've explained some changes that they've made to their presentation on the basis of doing a practice, and there's further evidence of planning of the presentation and so on. So again, it's not necessary, but students who tend to do that tend to be the students who do well, because they're conscientious and they want to do it as thoroughly as they possibly can. So I hope that's a presentation record part A, an example. In fact, this is taken from the one of the exemplars on the Oxford AQA website. I think it might be the A star or the A grade IPQ, if you want to go and look at the full project. So this is the section that the supervisor completes, presentation record part B. It goes on to 2 pages, or there's 2 sides to it. Obviously, if you're typing electronically into it, the pages will just naturally continue. So it might actually be longer in the end. So looking at the first page on the left, the first 2 sections, the nature of the audience and the nature of the presentation, I'm not going to show you examples of how to fill that in, because it's very, very simple and factual. You just answer what's in the box there. So you just describe the nature of the audience, number of people involved and who they are and so on, and the nature of the presentation, PowerPoint display, you know, just describe exactly what's happened, and it can be a few lines, that's perfectly fine. Don't feel like you have to put huge amounts, you know, to fill the box. That's fine. The last section on the first page, comment on the content and delivery, I've got an example here, is worth talking about in a bit more detail. So this is where the supervisor comments on the content and delivery of the presentation. For example, the clarity of ideas, the structure of the presentation, the pace and engagement. So think, and this is the primary place where in terms of assessment, where Oxford AQA and the exam board will be looking for the evidence. So this tells us how good the presentation was. So definitely make sure that you do both. You comment on the content, i.e. what the student is actually talking about, and also how it's delivered. So how clear it is, you know, how organized the student is, and so on. So in this example, you can see there's a reasonable balance of content and delivery. Perhaps a little bit more on the delivery could be good. So it's slightly more focused on what the student actually said rather than how they said it. The small criticism, but there's a good level of detail generally. I think this is the A grade IPQ exemplar on the Oxford AQA website. Here's another example. This is a bit shorter this time. I can't remember. This is one of the exemplars again. This is a good on the delivery. So you can see the supervisor saying it was very clear, it was structured, good engagement with the audience and so on. But obviously more detail could be given on the content of the presentation. Actually, very little, if anything, is said on what the student actually said. So in some ways, this one is deficient. I would say that really there's only half. This has only been half completed. So the key thing here is make sure you say something in detail on the content and something in detail on the delivery. Then the other part is where the supervisor records the Q&A, and there's a space there for 5 questions. And please do include 5 questions. You know, that should be what you aim to do. If you include more, that's fine, and you can use extra sheets and so on. But given there's only 10 minutes for the questions, that's only 2 minutes per question, which isn't a huge amount if the questions are particularly good. So the supervisor here comments on the response of the candidates to questions that demonstrated understanding and grasp of the project and its production. So it says, give examples of 5 questions and answers. So there's some good Q&A here on the process, perhaps a little more on the project findings. So if you look at the questions, the first one is about evaluation of resources. Then the second one is about resources. Third one is about challenges of reading technical material. Fourth one is about some sort of personal question based on the findings, and the last one is a clarification of a term. So you might say with these questions, maybe there could be a slightly more of a focus on the actual project findings. You know, so the student is going to answer the question, give a conclusion, and you know, you want at least one of the questions to kind of push that conclusion a bit further, because that's the way in which students show real understanding of what they're saying. And actually, for the highest achieving students, it's where they can really show this idea of mastery, which is in the assessment information, that they can really show to get up to that A star level, to be able to really show that they understand the topic inside out and they can respond to questions effectively. Here's another example. So I've only just included the first 3 questions here. On this one, it's a good mixture of questions about the project and the process. So you've got a question about how much evidence is there. So that's particularly about the content, the first question. The second one is about content as well, and the third one is about a bit more about the process and asking the student to justify decisions that they made in their planning, why they've looked at particular aspects and not others. So even though there's only 3, there should be 5. There's a nice balance there of the questions and so on. When the supervisor records the responses, they don't have to be word for word. You can paraphrase what the student says, that's fine, or you can write it out word for word. But remember, the key thing is, you know, you need to write it in a way that it shows fully their response, because this is part of the assessment evidence. Okay, so what makes a good presentation? So some sort of final tips about presentations. So well prepared and thoroughly rehearsed obviously makes a good presentation. We've talked about that already. Clear and easy for a non-specialist audience to understand. Engaging and stimulating. Concise and clearly structured with an introduction, main section, and so on. Clearly argued lines of reasoning leading to a logical conclusion. Well paced with polished, confident, and clearly audible delivery, and delivered in a relaxed manner, maintaining rapport and eye contact with the audience. Finally, supported by well-prepared and relevant visual aids which support the presentation rather than leading. As I read these, I'm slightly concerned about how many I do and don't tick with this particular presentation I'm doing now. But even if I don't tick many of them, hopefully you can go away and take the slides and use these and share them with students if you want to. Just make it really clear exactly what they're doing. The key thing here is that the delivery of the presentation is important, and that's part of what's assessed. So the student should be conscious of that. You know, how can they make it interesting for for the audience? And you know, I always found, as a supervisor and coordinator, the presentation was my favorite part of the process, because even though students can get a bit nervous or, you know, anxious about it, and it can involve a lot of organizing if you're the coordinator and there's lots of supervisors, lots of students, it's the kind of cherry on the cake at the end of the process. You see the student standing up and giving the story of the whole project right from the beginning to the end. Often it can be quite a challenging process students go through. It can be difficult and so on. But you know, more often than not, it's largely the case that it's a real kind of realization for the students of actually what they've achieved in producing a 5,000 word research planned evaluated written report. And it's brilliant to see, and it showcases, I mean, I don't, in my experience as a teacher, I haven't seen that in other subjects I've taught, where students can just really demonstrate exactly what they've learned in a very direct and clear and individual way. And so I'd encourage you to encourage them to really focus on how to bring out the full story of their project. So just a few other things. So obviously, you know, to do with what makes a good PowerPoint slide, you just don't want loads and loads of writing, which I know I've done in this presentation. You know, the student should use the presentation as a sort of starting point or a reminder or so on, and that they can then go on to talk about the points that are made rather than just reading off slides. Here are some examples of presentations from the IPQ exemplars. And this one isn't complete, so there are other slides on this one. It's not the whole thing, but I've put a few examples on here just to show you. So here you can see there's a clear, simple slide. This was actually the A-star IPQ exemplar. So don't think that, you know, it looks reasonably simple. That's not a weakness in any way. In fact, it's a strength. The slides are very clear, simple. There's some relevant images that just keep the student's attention, the audience's attention, and the good use of slide titles. So it's very clear what each slide is talking about. So, you know, that's perfectly fine. I mean, some students will put video clips, embed them into PowerPoint, and, you know, you can obviously make it, you know, more interactive in that way. And that's brilliant, but it's definitely not the case that it's necessary. You can do something very effective in a simple way. Here's another example. Again, this is the A grade exemplar about pandas. And this is the whole presentation. You can see the slides are mostly clear. There's a good use of visuals, mostly. Perhaps a little bit brief on the process, so it's largely focused on the report, this presentation. There's something on the aims at the beginning, you know, this third slide, and the research methods. But a little bit more on the process itself would be good. And maybe one or two of the slides are a little bit text heavy, which might be something that could be addressed. Okay, so that is the section on the presentation. I hope that makes sense. As I said, ask questions as we go along, but I'll look at them at the end. I am just going to very quickly check that we're all okay, and yeah, okay, everything looks fine, and so on. That's really good. Okay, so I hope you're still with me. We've looked at the presentation. Now we're going to look at the reflection. So this section is a bit shorter, you'll be pleased to hear, than the previous one. And as I said before, this is, I'm specifically talking about that last page in the production log, which is called the summary and reflection page, and it's completed by the student. It should be the last thing that a student does, and it should be done after the presentation. I think it might even say at the top of the page that that's the case, but it should be the last thing that students do before they submit their IPQ to their supervisor. It relates to AO5, the last assessment objective, which is the evaluation of the product, which means the report, the process, so right from the beginning, decisions, planning, and so on, and personal development itself. And as I said, we're focusing primarily on the summary and reflection part of the production log. However, it is also worth noting that what we're talking about is evaluation, and that is crucial throughout the project. So, you know, in AO2, part of AO2 is monitoring progress against objectives, and that's a form of evaluation. And AO3 involves evaluating sources. That's obviously evaluation as well. So some of what we say might be applicable to other areas, but it's definitely a case. I just want to talk about that last page in the production log. And you can see again, we're talking about AO5 here, and it's 10% of the final grade. Now, that doesn't mean 10% of the final grade is based on that last page of the production log, because there's other places where students can demonstrate or evidence their evaluation of strengths and weaknesses. For example, in the presentation, as we just saw, or there's an element of evaluation as you go along, monitoring progress against objectives, for example, in AO2. But obviously, if the summary and reflection page in the production log is completed poorly, with little detail, then AO5 is going to take a big hit and the student's going to struggle. Okay. So AO5 is worth just focusing on here, because it says the following: evaluate the strengths and weaknesses of the project process, including a review of our own learning arising from it and the product, i.e. the written report. And as I said, it's 10% of the total grade. So this is the AO we're focusing on in particular. Now, what does the spec say about this section of the process? So it says students will evaluate outcomes in relation to both the agreed objectives and to own learning and performance. So agreed objectives are obviously what they decided right at the beginning that they were going to do in their project to achieve their aim. Students will evaluate the process, the project process that they go through, so deciding on aims and objectives, planning, researching, and so on. The production log should include a review of the written report. Oh, by the way, so what I've done here is I've gone through the specification and just pulled out for you all the key parts that relate to this aspect of the process. So it should include a review of the written report as well. So in summary, this part of the production log, the final thing students do, 3 things are needed. They need to make sure they tick 3 boxes: that they evaluate the strengths and weaknesses of the process they've gone through from beginning to end. They evaluate the strengths and weaknesses of the written report that they've produced. You know, is there an element of bias? Have they answered the question fully? Have they structured the report in an appropriate way? Could they have maybe researched a bit more thoroughly or something like this? And finally, a review reflection of a student's own learning and development that working on and completing an IPQ has resulted in. So that the student has, the student has been amazed that they've developed their ability to research and select resources, which they found really difficult at the beginning because there was so much to do, but they got guidance from certain people and they learned certain processes or skills or so on. Or that, you know, student might be saying that they've really developed planning skills, that they've managed to learn techniques using Gantt charts or timelines or whatever it is they've used to really organize, and it's something that they've struggled with in the past and so on. So that personal element needs to be there as well. So let's have a look at this final page, the summary and reflection page. It's the last page of the production log. It must be completed. What does it say here? Reflection evaluation when you have completed. So after you've completed your report and given your presentation, it must be the last thing students do. So the first thing that students must do is give a summary of their project. So the page is summary and reflection. So they must give a summary of the project, i.e. a brief statement of no more than 1 paragraph of the main aim, the objectives, and the key findings and conclusions drawn. That might be that they can look at what they did in their presentation to help them with this, or it might be that the intro of their report does it nicely. But there needs to be a brief statement of exactly what they've done in their report, a summary of what occurred. As I said, this needs to be done after everything else. And this section here, so some students may choose to use these questions to structure their reflection, which is fine. However, the key thing is to make sure that 3 key areas are covered that I've described already: the process, students' own learning, and the product, i.e. the report. So in that section I've just highlighted here, this section, in the production log, it does give you some questions that the student can use, but it does say some questions you may wish to answer in this section. So some students may want to just answer all of those as clearly as they can. That would give a reasonable structure. Some students may want to talk about other things. That's fine. So it's up to them to decide whether to use. Now, obviously, if a student isn't answering the majority of those in some way, then there's a problem. But just bear in mind, the key thing is that they talk in detail about those 3 overall areas. There's also a distinction here in this top section between reflection and evaluation, and I just wanted to clarify this, that reflection is of the student's own work, and evaluation is looking at the strengths and weaknesses of the process and the product involved. So here's one possible approach that you might use to help students sort of think about this in a more structured way. So they might start by thinking about the project process. So the whole, right from the beginning, aims and objectives, planning, research, making decisions, etc., monitoring progress. What were the strengths? What did they do well, and what were the weaknesses? And then document them, and then do the same for the actual report. So the strengths and the weaknesses. So, you know, a weakness of the process might be that they didn't start planning until quite late, and then there was an element of rushing. Or that a strength might be that their research was very thorough and they managed to really focus on some specific resources that they found. In terms of the report, a strength might be that they structured the report in an effective way and it helped the readers to understand what they were doing and it led naturally to the conclusion. Or a weakness could be that they spent too much of the report talking about a particular issue, or there was an element of bias that they, you know, considered one aspect a bit too much and didn't support another possibility, and so on. But that's just a kind of a brainstorming way for students to get thinking about the right type of things. And then there's a separate section which is review of own learning, which, as I said before, would be things like you know, has what the student done going to be of help to what they go on to do at university or careers or so on? Have they developed particular skills that have been really beneficial in other subjects? What were the particular challenges that they faced and how did they overcome them, and so on. So that's the sort of personal section. Don't do that in terms of strengths and weaknesses. That's just a kind of the student talking about how they found the process useful. And then I've just put these in here. These are just some questions to help you help students think about the process and the report. So with the process, were the aims and objectives appropriate, and so on. With the report, do you actually answer the question that you set at the beginning? Did you achieve the aim and objective? So just some questions there. Again, you can take the presentation away. You can use these, give them to the students to help structure what they are saying, what they're thinking. And just some general advice to give students when they're completing this last bit of the production. There's a temptation, because it's the last thing to do, and the report is written and completed and the presentation is done, for students to think it's just a box to tick and it doesn't really matter. Please encourage them not to think that. As I said before, it's a key part of the process. It relates directly to one of the assessment objectives. If there's time, I always, as a supervisor and coordinator, encourage students to have a bit of space, bit of time between doing the presentation and completing the summary and reflection page. And you know, if you could give a few days or even a week before they complete it, then what I suggest to students personally is that they go and have a few days without thinking about it, and then look back at their report, maybe read through it again and through their production log with a fresh pair of eyes, as much as that's possible, and complete it then, in order that you don't rush and that you can kind of just get a bit of perspective between you and the project process itself. But the key thing is for students to take it seriously and not to rush. Again, I've just talked about this, but perspective is key. If students can have a bit of time before they complete it, that's important. What is also important is that students don't ask other people for their advice or what they should write in it. It is a personal thing. It's got to come from the student to be completed by the student. Balance is crucial. So strengths and weaknesses need to be included. Now, some students don't talk about any weaknesses at all. Others will be too negative and only talk about weaknesses. students need to be talking about both. No project is perfect. There's always things that students or any of us could do better. So make sure the students are including both aspects. Structure the review properly. You could even have subheadings. Here I'm talking about the process. So you might have a section on the summary at the start, then a section on the process, section on the product, and then a section on the own learning. That's perfectly fine. A bit like you would structure the report, sometimes with section headings. That's perfectly fine. And encourage students to be honest. So you can't really fake the reflection. I mean, whoever's marking the IPQ, once they've read the whole production log up to that point, and they've read the report, and they've seen the presentation, if a student is saying things which are not true, or they're saying something's a strength which it isn't, it will be very clear from the person assessing it and grading it. So just remind students that that's the case. I mean, this isn't a tick box or a kind of, this is a real thing, a real document, a real record of the process that they've been. Detail and scope is important, so make sure that they detail without being repetitious. That's a key thing. And scope means covering those 3 areas again. Don't confuse detail with word count. Really the same point. Saying something once is perfectly fine as long as it's in detail and clear. So doing well on the summary and reflection. The A grade descriptor, so this is taken from the specification. So to get an A grade on this section, we'd be looking for something like this: detailed and insightful evaluation. The student reflects on his or her own learning in a detailed and insightful manner. So those are the things we're looking for: detail, and that the student really nails exactly what what the issues are in their particular project, because they'll be obvious to the person marking it or grading it, and we want to see students picking up on those things. And for the A star descriptor, you're looking at, again, insightful but sophisticated throughout. So the student is able to really get right down to the sort of the key. Even if the points they're making are very subtle, they're very relevant to the process, and the student is aware of what's happened. So as with the presentation exemplars, I've got some here. Again, you might go away and look at them in a bit more detail. I'm not going to read through this now, but this is sections of a student's summary and reflection. Here you see the report is summarized at the beginning, and there's recognition of the flaws that led to a lack of balance. So this student is doing all 3 of the areas sort of in a flowing, simultaneous way, and that's fine as well. Reflection on own learning is detailed. They're saying they thoroughly enjoyed the project, the chance to experience university work style, and so on. There's some reflection on the process and some evaluation of some of the strengths of research conducted. And there's some further evaluation on strengths of the presentation and weaknesses of the research. There's a nice balance of strengths and weaknesses here, and there's a focus on the process and the final product, as well as the student's own learning. We might say that perhaps more could be said about the weaknesses of the aims as well as the planning, but there's always something that a student could have talked more about in this section. This is a reasonably good one. Another example, this again is from one of the exemplars. There's a nice summary of the strategy taken right at the beginning, so why the student approached it the way they did. A reflection on own learning is detailed. Examples of well-evidenced conclusion, good evaluation of the process and own learning. So there you can see, again, the student hasn't divided it up into clear sections, but they're clearly ticking all of the main boxes there, and they're giving some nice detail about what they've done. So I hope that's clear. There's 3 key areas in addition to giving a summary of the findings. 3 key areas are evaluating the strengths and weaknesses of the report, of the process, and something about the student's own learning. And the thing about the summary and reflection is, if the student has done everything else well, if the project's gone well, and by that I mean they've engaged with it fully. I mean, it will still be the case that there have been issues and students have had to make decisions and it's been difficult. But if the student is engaged fully with the process, this part should be easy, because really they're just thinking back and remembering what happened, and having to be quite astute and careful and clear and being able to identify exactly what happened. But there's nothing new here. They're just describing what's happened, and they're reflecting on the process and the product. It's when students have not engaged with the process and they get to this point, and to some extent there's not a huge amount to talk about because the project is reasonably weak. So so the students who put a lot into it, this should be fairly straightforward. Okay, so that is the end of this second section and the end of the webinar. This is a chance now for anybody to ask questions about either the either section of the presentation or of this presentation, so either the presentation or the summary and reflection. I'm just having a look now to see if there's any questions. Oh, somebody's asked, I've missed the first 2 webinars, how can I access them? I'm not sure if they're on the Oxford AQA website. It may be that they were just sent out to those people who attended, which obviously wouldn't help you. So I'd encourage whoever asked that question, I'd encourage you to contact Oxford AQA directly and ask if you can have those presentations sent to you. And I'm sure they'll be able to do that. Details on the website. Let's have a look if there's any more questions. I've got lots of hellos from the beginning. Let's have a look. So I can't see any. I'm just going to give it a couple more minutes. I think somebody's asked a question about whether they will be repeated in the future. So is that about these hub webinars? If that's about the hub webinars, I don't know about that. Again, if you contact Oxford AQA, I'm sure they'll be able to tell you, or to give you possibly send you the slides and the presentations. That will be ideal. Somebody mentioned that they're thinking of offering the IPQ soon, which is good. So look, can we complete the seminar? Can we complete seminar 1 and 2 now? No, we can't do seminar 1 and 2 now. But as I said, contact Oxford AQA. Let's have a look. Because these webinars are really very useful and helps making informed choice. Well, I'm glad to hear that they're useful. That's very good. Let's have a look. Just wait a minute. I'll just give it 1 more minute. So it's interesting to see that there are some of you out there who are not delivering the IPQ yet and are possibly looking at it. I'd really encourage you to look through those 2 documents at the beginning, the specification and the teacher guidance document, and just remind you that the IPQ is based on the EPQ, which is the UK market leading project-based qualification for students 16 to 19 years old, so students who are doing A-levels. And there's nearly 40,000 students in the UK doing the EPQ, and I've been involved with it in several schools for a good part of 10 years, and I have to say it's the best thing that I've done as a teacher in schools, because you get to deal with students in a totally different way than in a classroom setting where you're teaching them from the specification directly. Giving students that power to decide what they're doing and how they're doing it is really challenging, because not only has their role changed, your role has changed, because you're not the one with all the knowledge and the power anymore. You're more like the kind of scaffolding and support within which they're developing their work. So I really encourage you to introduce it in your school if you're not already, even if on a small scale to begin with a few students. That's always a good way to begin. I'm just going to check to see if there's any more questions. Okay, I don't think there are. I'm just always very conscious that I'm missing something. Yeah, no, I can't see any more questions. So if there are any more questions, obviously get in touch with Oxford AQA, and there are advisors and people, myself, who can answer anything in particular. As I'm sure you know, if you're delivering it now, it is very different from delivering A-levels. and the process involved is very, and in fact I say to people not to scare them, but it's as different as it could possibly be from A levels. You know, how it's organized, how it's assessed, what the student does, what the super teacher does, it's very different. So I'm always very conscious that people are aware of how it's different, but that the support is there if people want it. And I know Oxford AQA have got some very good systems in place to support you. So please get in touch if you need further help. The final webinar, which will be on assessment, I'd very much encourage you to come to. Details of it, I think, are on the Oxford AQA website, and it will cover basically how to assess the IPQ with some real examples of what to do, looking at some particular projects. And that can be, as a supervisor, one of the most challenging parts of the process to do, because it isn't an easy thing to do, particularly at the beginning. But it is surprising how once you get up and running and you do a few, you can get your eye in quite quickly, and you know, it does certainly get easier to do. So that's the next one to give you some further support. I hope this has been useful. I'll stop talking now, and have a good rest of the day, and good luck with delivering the IPQ. Thank you very much.